Chapter 3. You're a Dirty, Stinking Jew. 10 minutes past the lake, after accelerating to top speed again, the express slowed and ground to its first stop. This station was always a busy one, as Ari well knew. He had moved to the seat next to the rear exit, from where he could observe the entire platform through the window and keep a wary eye on anyone entering his car. About 24 passengers boarded the train, all of them in the forward cars, except for an affectionate young couple. Arms around each other, they awkwardly negotiated a few steps down the narrow aisle and seated themselves 4 rows from the front, where they cuddled and babbled intimately, as though no one else existed in the entire world. Nothing to fear from them. The train started with a lurch, and Ari leaned back to relax. 18 more minutes at high speed, and the express would stop at his own village. The police would almost certainly be watching the station. He wanted no more confrontation, which left him with only one alternative. The conductor, now whistling his own off-key rendition of a nondescript tune, came through to check tickets again. "I've got a transfer at Luckenwald," said Ari casually. "How far?" "3 more stops, about an hour." Ari leaned out into the aisle and motioned for the conductor to come closer. The man bent his huge frame down, and Ari confided in a low voice, "Some bug got me, keeps me going to the WC. If you come through and I'm not here, you'll know where I am." "I won't go looking for you," came the easy response with a wink. He made his way slowly up the aisle and exited the car. "That was simple. He'll think I'm still aboard." Smiling with satisfaction, Ari leaned his head back on the seat, letting himself relax, but at the same time pondering alternate scenarios, trying desperately to keep himself awake. It would be a disaster to fall asleep and go on past his station, but it was a terrible fight just to keep his eyes open. If they once shut, he'd be gone. The few minutes seemed like hours. At last the train began to slow. Ari was instantly on his feet. Taking his hefty briefcase, he went into the narrow exit at the rear of the car, shut that door behind him, and pulled the outside door open. About 50 yards before the train reached the station, he jumped out on the side away from the platform and disappeared into the woods. There he waited for a few moments, peering out from behind the trees down the tracks toward the station, making certain that no one had seen him. Then he turned and ran toward his parents' home. The scattered clouds had thinned, and at first only briefly and intermittently obscured the moon. Ari followed a faint but familiar path that avoided the roads. Traversing dampened fields and dripping forest, he savored familiar odors of dank earth and washed foliage that brought back childhood memories. He had taken this shortcut many times as a boy when ordered by his father to go to the village on errands. In daylight, he could cover the distance at a steady run in about 20 minutes. But with the clouds once again growing thicker and the weight of the heavy briefcase impeding him, it took almost double the normal time, costing him precious minutes that he could ill afford. The long run was particularly exhausting because of the recent sleepless nights. Ari cursed the darkness each time he stumbled. As he approached the farm, however, picking his way cautiously along a narrow, wooded ravine that cut through the fields, he muttered a grateful thanks to the thickening clouds that obscured the full moon and covered his furtive movements. At last he was close enough to make out, in the transient intervals of filtered moonlight, the dim outline of the dozen small houses that made up the commune. Huddled together in a semicircle, they faced the road about 100 feet beyond. All were dark except for his own house, where the kitchen light was burning. It was far too late for his parents still to be up. Were the loathsome secret police in there questioning them? Or had that job been finished, and were the Stasis now hidden outside? Where were the watchdogs that were always turned loose to roam the farm at night? Why weren't they yapping a wild, tail-wagging welcome for him? There was a soft, erratic breeze blowing past him toward the houses, carrying his scent. The dogs, whom he loved so well, should have come running to greet him. He had worried about that, wondering how he could quiet them quickly. Yet all was silent, too quiet. If the police are hiding somewhere, watching for me, they would have had to order the dogs confined inside, or they would never stop barking. That has to be it. Ari knew every inch of the collective farm. Cautiously, he circled to his left, following the shallow, tree-lined gully that skirted the cluster of farm buildings and marked the border between them and the surrounding acres of freshly plowed and planted soil. Nothing. At last he approached the narrow, graveled lane that led from his village to the next one a few kilometers away. He stood motionless for several minutes, pressed against the trunk of a tall poplar tree, trying desperately to pierce the darkness along the road and through the trees toward the houses, every faculty straining to detect the slightest sound or faintest odor. Was that a whiff of tobacco exuding from someone's breath or clothing? It came and went so quickly on the light and shifting breeze that he couldn't be sure. A twig snapped over to his right. Ari turned his head quickly and tried to pierce the impenetrable darkness. The noise had been so slight and fleeting. Perhaps his imagination was beginning to play tricks. Suddenly there was that faint and elusive odor of tobacco again. This time he was certain of it. Someone's out there. He could sense their presence now, but where? More minutes passed in motionless alert as Ari pressed against the tree trunk, ears and eyes straining to locate his hidden stalkers. Did they know he was here? For a brief moment the clouds parted, and his eyes caught the glint of moonlight on a windshield, a car hidden in the trees just to his right and only a few yards behind him. He had walked within a few feet without seeing it. Had they seen him? Ari crouched low and waited for the clouds to part again, but the darkness only thickened. Suddenly a match was struck, briefly illuminating a man's face not more than 50 feet away. Ari heard the match blown out, saw the red glow of a cigarette, then smelled the burning tobacco. One enemy located. Where were the others? The smoker was hiding on the edge of the narrow finger of fir and birch that extended up out of the gully that Ari had been following and onto a small promontory. It commanded a view of the country lane and each of the houses. Obviously, they were not expecting him to come across the fields from the train station, but to arrive in a car along the road. Ari cautiously re-entered the fringe of brush and trees and began moving in the direction of the red glow that appeared each time the smoker took a drag. How often he had crept among these very trees, playing hide-and-seek as a boy, never dreaming he would return one day for this deadly game. Thankfully, there had been enough rain to soak the ground so that he could move across dead leaves without making a sound. Of course, if he could move noiselessly, so could they. Soon he was close enough to dimly glimpse his quarry on the slight rise silhouetted against the dark sky, where he paced impatiently back and forth, apparently not enjoying his duty. Where are the others? "Hands up!" The deep voice, sounding as startled as Ari now felt, came from a few feet behind and to his right. "Alex, I've got him! Over here!" Raising his hands and turning slowly around, Ari saw a dark figure separate itself from the tree trunk of which it had seemed to be a part when he had so carefully passed it moments before. Warily, the man approached him. Ari could hear the crashing of underbrush as the smoker, now shining a flashlight, hurried toward them. "Turn around." The tone of voice had changed from surprise to fierce satisfaction. "Hands on top of your head." Ari made as though he were obeying just as the first beam of the flashlight came through the trees and hit his captor momentarily in the eyes. In that instant, in a smooth but swift motion that almost seemed to be part of his submissive turning around, Ari's leg lashed out. Just as his foot made contact with the weapon, he heard it go off and felt a searing pain on the side of his head. In another swift motion, he whirled to face the second man. Ari's other foot nearly took his opponent's head off, sending him crashing into the tree that he'd been hiding behind, where he slumped and lay still. Ari was now on the ground, Luger in hand. 2 shots from the man with the flashlight, now turned off, passed through the space he had just vacated. Ari answered with 2 shots of his own, aimed at the fleeting pinpoints of fire that had come from his quarry's gun. The quick burst of gunfire echoed into the distance, then eerie silence. A heavy mist had settled in, and the accumulated moisture was beginning to fall from soaked leaves. The haphazard droplets provided the only sound as Ari lay in the mud and wet leaves, listening for any movement that would betray the presence of the rest of the team. Could there have been only 2? His head was throbbing where the bullet had grazed him. Cautiously probing fingers came back wet with warm fluid. Thankfully, the wound was scarcely bleeding. A close call. Beyond the trees and barn, Ari saw lights go on in several houses. Dogs barked briefly, were called hurriedly back inside, then silence again, punctuated by the now steady dripping. He waited, not moving a muscle, listening. 1 minute, 2, 3, 5, 10. Precious time. One by one, the lights went out. No one had come outside to investigate. They wouldn't dare. Motionless, Ari continued to strain his eyes and ears, but still there was no movement that he could detect, either from the man he had shot at or from the one lying just behind him. "Alex, I've got him." Those words still ringing in his memory seemed to indicate that these two had been stationed there alone. Hugging the ground, Ari pulled himself in imperceptible increments back toward the motionless form. There was no sign of pulse or breathing. The man's head was at an impossible angle, his neck apparently broken. Still no sound from Alex. Nothing except the light falling of rain and steady dripping. He had squandered far too much time already. Jumping to his feet, Ari moved silently and swiftly from tree to tree. He almost stepped on the crumpled form before he saw it. A quick examination told him that this man was also dead. With trembling fingers, Ari felt through the dead man's pockets for car keys, but found none. Rising slowly to his feet, he felt a sudden wave of nausea and had to grab a tree to steady himself. Never had he killed a fellow human being, nor been so close to death himself. Half dazed now, Ari made his way back to the other victim and went through his pockets. Still no keys. They're in the car. Okay. Hurrying out of the woods, he ran across the few yards of open terrain to the cover of the barn, then moved quickly along its exterior to the other end, where he peered cautiously around a corner at the houses. All was quiet and dark, except for his own house. The kitchen light was on. Were there more police inside? No, they would have come running at the sound of shots. Noiselessly, he approached the window and peered inside. Revulsion swept over him. There he sat, the tall, familiar hulk hunched over the table, drinking the beer he loved too well and which they could ill afford. There were nearly a dozen empty bottles on the floor. His mother was standing nearby, tearful, unsure, emanating an air of hopelessness that infuriated Ari when he thought of all she had suffered. The words weren't audible, but it was obvious they were having a bitter quarrel. Had they even heard the shots? Cautiously, he circled the house, Luger in one hand, briefcase in the other, searching the darkness for any movement, ears straining to pick up any sound. Nothing. The only door into the tiny dwelling opened onto a narrow pantry from where it led straight through the kitchen. There was no way he could slip in, recover the papers, and get away without being seen. Nor could he wait for them to go to bed. He shuffled his feet on the porch, coughed, then paused a moment before trying the door. It was locked. Knocking loudly, he heard his mother's footsteps approaching. "Who is it?" she called in a tremulous voice. "It's me." There was a gasp of shocked disbelief and a moment's hesitation. Then the door was flung open. "Ari!" He stepped quickly inside and closed the door behind him. His mother threw her arms around him, then drew back and touched his wound tenderly. "You're bleeding. What happened, love?" "I'm okay. It's nothing. Just scratched myself on a dead branch coming through the woods from the station." "Are you sure?" she asked tearfully. "It wasn't the police." "Police?" he asked, feigning surprise at such a question. "They've been looking for you." "They have? Why?" "You don't know?" Ari shook his head. "They were here?" "A couple hours ago," growled his father, who hadn't moved from his seat at the table where he'd been glaring in silence. "Got us out of bed. Tore your room apart. You've been shot, you liar. I wish they'd killed you." His speech was slurred, but anger gave a convincing energy to the stinging words. He obviously still had his full wits. "Did the police do that to you, Ari?" his mother asked again anxiously. She had gotten a clean cloth from a drawer, held it under the tap at the sink, and was now dabbing with it at his wound. "I said it was a sharp branch." Ari pushed her gently away. "I'm okay. Look, I don't have much time." "Less than you think," gloated his father. "I'm calling the police." "You want them to find you like this?" bluffed Ari contemptuously. "Look at you, slobbering drunk again." There was no time to waste. He turned and headed toward his bedroom. "I'm not drunk, and I know exactly what I'm saying, you Jew bastard." Ari whirled around, stung by the ultimate insult, and started toward him. "What did you say, old man? You dare to call me a Jew?" Past all control, the words were flung out once more. "You're a dirty, stinking Jew." He grabbed an empty bottle by the neck and raised it to defend himself as Ari advanced toward him. "Stop! Ari! Franz!" Ari's mother threw herself between the two men as her husband lurched to his feet. "No, he'll hear it. Now. I told you it was a mistake keeping the Jew baby, but you just had to. Now look what you've got. We'll be in prison because of him, unless we turn him in." "I promised. I gave my word. Please, Franz." "No, I'm not going to pretend any longer that this filthy Jew is my son. I'm calling the police."